August 8, 1945, Woodsides Camp, Michigan. The damp air of the American countryside greeted the group of German women prisoners as they were unloaded from the transport trucks. The tension among them was palpable, as they had been through so much already. The fear and exhaustion from their journey were written all over their faces. But they steeled themselves, preparing for the worst. They had been told over and over again about the horrors of American camps. The whispers of atrocities committed by the Allies were deeply ingrained in their minds, and there was little room for hope. When the truck doors swung open, the women instinctively flinched, expecting to be greeted with violence or harsh orders. Instead, they found themselves staring at soldiers who were nothing like the monsters they had imagined. They looked almost ordinary, even kind in comparison. There was no shouting, no rough handling, just a quiet command to step down from the truck. The women looked at each other in disbelief, unsure of what to make of this new reality. They had been prepared for savagery, but were met with a level of calm they had never expected. The women shuffled forward, unsure of what to expect next. As they stepped onto the ground, the sensation of the soft earth beneath their feet was a stark contrast to the cold, barren environments they had become accustomed to. It felt almost surreal to them. They had been subjected to months of confinement in harsh conditions, but here the grass seemed to stretch out in all directions, and the sky above them was wide and clear. For a moment, they couldn't help but feel a sense of confusion. This didn't match the stories they had been told. They were led toward the camp, and with each step, their fear began to give way to tentative curiosity. Guard towers loomed in the distance, but they appeared more like distant silhouettes than oppressive symbols of confinement. The camp seemed to be in order, too neat, almost to the point of being unsettling. The clean white fences and orderly rows of buildings were so different from the cramped, overcrowded conditions they had expected. They were prepared for chaos, for brutality, but everything here seemed too calm, too organized. The first shock came when they were asked to line up outside one of the buildings. There, they were offered water, fresh clothes, and even soap. Real soap. The sight of it nearly brought some of the women to tears. For years, they had been accustomed to makeshift soaps, harsh, gritty, and barely useful. This was different. This was soap that smelled fresh, clean, like a memory of a time before the war had tarnished everything. It seemed like an impossible luxury. As they entered the building, they were met by an unexpected sight. White towels, neatly folded on cots, waiting for each of them. There was no hesitation from the American soldiers. They simply smiled and showed them where to change. The women, disoriented and unable to fully grasp the situation, did as instructed. They were shown to a small washroom where hot water was running from the taps. They paused for a moment, staring at the stream of warm water, wondering if it was a trick. It had been so long since any of them had experienced anything like this. Hot water was a luxury they had all but forgotten. They stepped into the showers, and as the hot water cascaded over their bodies, it was as though they were being washed of more than just dirt. The grime of war, the months of neglect, the loss of dignity. They felt all of it slip away with each passing second. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they could breathe. There was a strange, almost surreal comfort in something as simple as cleanliness. It was a luxury they had never anticipated, and yet, here it was. The showers were followed by a medical checkup, another surprise. The women had been led to believe that any health issues would go unaddressed in a prison camp. But here, the medical staff seemed genuinely concerned about their well-being. They were asked questions about their health, given simple but thorough examinations. For many of the women, this was the first time in years that anyone had paid attention to their medical needs beyond basic survival. Some of them felt awkward, not knowing how to respond to the kindness they were being shown. As the day went on, the women were assigned small rooms in one of the camp's barracks. The rooms were plain, but they had real beds with clean sheets. For the first time in months, they were able to lie down in comfort. This was another shock. In the other camps they had been to, the ground was their bed. Here they had mattresses, pillows, sheets, things they had almost forgotten existed. They stared at the beds for a while, not quite able to believe that they were being given such simple comforts. Despite everything that had happened, there was a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over them. The fear didn't vanish completely, but it began to recede into the background, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation, hope. It was tentative at first, but it was there, flickering like a fragile flame in the distance. They didn't understand why this was happening, why the Americans were treating them with such unexpected kindness. But as the day wore on, they realized something. They were no longer just prisoners. They were being treated as people, as humans who had suffered enough. As night fell and the women gathered in the mess hall for their first meal, they found themselves in a strange position. The food was different from what they were used to, warm, well-cooked, and filling. For a brief moment, they forgot they were prisoners of war. They were simply women, sitting down to a meal, sharing stories of their homes, of lives they had once known. It was a fleeting feeling, one that seemed almost too good to be true. They had been robbed of so much, but here, for just a moment, they had a taste of normalcy. But even as they ate, the shadows of their past experiences lingered. They knew that this wasn't a guarantee. They couldn't trust too easily, not after everything they had been through. They knew better than to believe that things could stay like this. But for now, in this moment, they allowed themselves to hope. It was a dangerous thing, but it was all they had left. And it was the first step toward the unimaginable future that lay ahead. The following morning, the women were greeted by a new reality that was, for all its strangeness, a welcome departure from the horrors they had endured. As they emerged from their barracks and gathered in the courtyard, the sunlight streamed through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. They could see American soldiers moving about, performing their duties with an air of professionalism that was different from the chaotic, violent commands they had grown used to. They had been told to expect violence and humiliation, but instead they found themselves surrounded by calm and order. It felt like a dream, but it was reality. And yet, doubt lingered in the corners of their minds. Captain Mitchell, who had met them the previous day, appeared again. This time, she was not alone. She was accompanied by a few other soldiers, all of whom seemed relaxed, their posture upright yet approachable. The women observed them warily, unsure of how to interpret their presence. Everything about the camp, the clean buildings, the gardens, the smiling soldiers, was at odds with their expectations. This was not the camp of nightmares they had imagined, and yet they couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. The captain walked toward the group of women, her steps measured but calm. She greeted them with a simple smile, her voice steady as she addressed them in German, with Klaus Weber, the translator, by her side. "I hope you are feeling more comfortable," she said. "Please, know that here you will be treated with respect, according to the Geneva Convention." The words seemed sincere, but after everything they had endured, the women were slow to trust. They had heard such promises before, from their own officers, only to find them hollow once the reality of captivity set in. Ingrid, who had been a field hospital administrator back in Germany, looked closely at Captain Mitchell. She studied her face, searching for any hint of cruelty behind the calm demeanor. But there was nothing that hinted at malice or deception. This only made Ingrid more uneasy. They had been betrayed by lies before, and it seemed impossible that their captors would now show them any form of mercy. Yet there was something different about this situation, something that made it difficult for her to dismiss. The Americans weren't like the Soviets or the British. This was a different kind of enemy, one she didn't fully understand. As the women were led through the camp, They were shown the daily routines of the other prisoners. They watched, wide-eyed, as the women worked in the gardens, some tending to the crops, while others moved about the camp with the kind of ease they had never expected to see in a prisoner. No guards shouted at them. There were no chains, no shackles. The women had been given tasks, but they were not treated as animals or slaves. It was a far cry from what Ingrid had witnessed in the labor camps of Poland and Russia, where prisoners were nothing more than expendable tools for the enemy's war machine. As they continued their tour, they were brought to a small building where the camp's medical staff worked. The women hesitated at the door, uncertain of what awaited them. To their surprise, they were greeted not by the cold, detached manner they expected, but by warmth and concern. The nurses here were efficient, yes, but they were also kind. They made the women feel like human beings again, not just nameless prisoners. For the first time in years, Ingrid felt something she had almost forgotten: dignity. The simple act of being treated with respect, of having her medical needs taken seriously, was something she never imagined she would experience again. After the examination, the women were told they would be assigned work duties, but they were also informed that they would have access to educational programs, along with the ability to write letters home. To some of the women, this seemed too good to be true. The mere thought of writing to their families after all this time was overwhelming. They had been taught to expect nothing, to expect that their lives were forfeit. The idea that they might be allowed to send news, to connect with their loved ones, was a privilege they had all but abandoned. That evening, the women sat together in the mess hall, still processing everything they had seen. They could hear laughter and conversation coming from other groups of prisoners, and for a moment they could almost forget that they were in a prison camp. The food they were served was better than anything they had eaten in years. Hearty, hot meals that filled them with a strange sense of comfort. They hadn't known what it felt like to be full in so long. But even as they ate, a part of them remained guarded. They couldn't help but wonder, was this just a facade? A way to break them down emotionally before the true horrors of captivity set in? Ingrid sat at the table, silently turning over her thoughts. She felt a gnawing unease deep in her chest. There was something insidious about this kindness, something that unsettled her. She wasn't sure if it was the lingering memory of past betrayals, or the simple fact that, in the back of her mind, she couldn't believe that the Americans truly meant what they were saying. She glanced around the room at the other women, some of whom were beginning to relax, their shoulders losing some of their tension. Others, like her, remained stiff, their minds clouded with doubt. They had all been through too much to let their guard down so easily. Despite her reservations, Ingrid couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her. There was a small, flickering spark of hope inside her, something she had buried long ago. She had lived through the horrors of war, and now, even as the women ate their meal, she couldn't help but think that they had just been given a glimpse of something better. She wasn't ready to trust it completely, not yet, but the possibility of something beyond survival, a possibility that might offer a glimpse of humanity in this broken world, was a concept she hadn't dared to entertain for years. And that alone, she thought, was a kind of victory. The meal ended, and the women returned to their barracks, the sounds of the camp still in the air around them. The sky had darkened, and for the first time in months, the women found themselves feeling something unfamiliar, a quiet, hesitant sense of peace. It was the peace of a prisoner who had been granted a moment of reprieve. It was fleeting, fragile, but it was enough for now. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something that might change the course of their lives forever. The next morning, the routine of the camp seemed to settle into a pattern. The women had gotten their first taste of what life might be like here, and while the previous day's experiences still felt surreal, they couldn't deny that something extraordinary was happening. As they were escorted to the medical facility for the day's checkups, they noticed something different in the air. It wasn't just the crispness of the morning or the smell of fresh bread from the camp kitchen, it was the sense of anticipation. The women had heard rumors about the American camp's advanced medical facilities, but they had no idea what to expect. Greta, the youngest of the women, had been suffering from severe toothaches for months. The pain had only worsened since her capture, but she had learned to ignore it, as there was no time for personal care in the harsh conditions of the prison camps. As they walked into the clinic, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The sterile white walls, the orderly rows of examination tables, and the calm atmosphere all seemed foreign to her. It was a place she never thought she would see again, not after everything she had been through. She had heard rumors of American doctors being skilled, but this seemed too good to be true. The nurse who greeted them was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. She directed them to the waiting area, where the women were asked to sit down and wait their turn. Greet couldn't stop glancing around the room. There were books on the tables, magazines, even some plants near the windows. It was hard to believe this was a prisoner of war camp. The women, who had expected a harsh, unsympathetic environment, were now being treated like people who mattered, and it was almost too much for them to process. Greet's mind raced as she tried to absorb the sight before her. It wasn't long before a tall, composed man in a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Patterson, the camp's chief medical officer, and began calling the women by name. His calm demeanor put them at ease, and he didn't waste any time asking about their general health. His questions were thorough but not invasive. He wanted to know how they had been feeling physically and emotionally. Gret, still in pain, felt a slight hesitation before she raised her hand. She wasn't used to asking for help. After all, her suffering had never seemed important enough to warrant attention. Dr. Patterson nodded understandingly and led her to one of the examination rooms. As Gret sat in the chair, she realized how much she had missed the simple comfort of a clean space and an attentive doctor. When Dr. Patterson examined her teeth, he didn't look disgusted or impatient, as some doctors had been in the past. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned, taking the time to carefully assess her condition. He explained that, fortunately, there was no permanent damage, but there would be a need for immediate treatment to alleviate the pain and prevent further complications. Gret listened intently, her heart racing with a strange combination of relief and disbelief. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in good hands. The idea that she could have her teeth treated properly, without fear of further suffering or neglect, was overwhelming. Dr. Patterson assured her that he would take care of the problem, and the procedure would take place that afternoon. She had been prepared to face this kind of pain for the rest of her life, but now it seemed like the impossible might actually be within reach. She couldn't believe it, but she didn't dare question it. As the procedure began, Greta was astonished at the level of care and attention the doctor gave her. He didn't rush, didn't make her feel like a burden. It was as though her comfort mattered as much as the treatment itself. The numbing process, though unfamiliar and strange, worked quickly. For the first time in months, the pain in her teeth subsided, replaced by a comforting numbness that spread through her jaw. As the doctor worked, he asked her about her life before the war, and Greta found herself talking about her family, her hometown, and the bakery her parents had run. The familiarity of the conversation, combined with the gentle touch of the dentist, made her feel human again. Grete was not the only one receiving treatment that day. Other women were led into the dental rooms, where they too experienced the same level of care. Some were treated for simple cavities, others for more serious issues that had been ignored in the camps. The women were in awe of the gentle hands of the American dentists, who seemed to truly care about their well-being. In the harshest of circumstances, the fact that someone could show such compassion felt like a miracle. As the day wore on, the women began to open up more, talking freely among themselves about the treatment they had received. They compared notes on their experiences, sharing their shock and gratitude at the level of care they had received. They were all still processing the events of the past few days, but one thing had become clear. This was not the treatment they had expected in a prison camp. And yet, in some ways, it was more than they had ever hoped for. It was a promise of recovery, of a life beyond survival, and it was slowly beginning to change the way they saw their captors. By the end of the day, Greta felt different. The ache in her teeth had vanished, replaced by a feeling of quiet satisfaction. She knew that this was a small victory, but in the world she had come from, small victories were hard to come by. The pain she had carried for so long was gone, and for the first time she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could heal. It wasn't just her teeth that had been fixed. Something inside her had been repaired too, and for that she was thankful. It had been a week since the women arrived at the camp, and each day seemed to bring with it more surprises. The discomfort and suspicion that had clung to them like a second skin slowly began to fade, though they couldn't completely shake the fear that it was all an illusion. But as the days passed, a new normal started to take shape, one where the impossible things they had once heard about or only dreamed of became tangible realities. Among those, the most shocking and profound was the sudden access to cleanliness. It wasn't just a luxury, it became a symbol of something much greater than they could comprehend. For the first time in years, the women were allowed to bathe, to wash themselves properly with soap and hot water. This simple yet extraordinary act was something they had taken for granted before the war, but now it felt like a privilege that carried deep emotional weight. The washroom facilities were immaculate, a sharp contrast to the grim, overcrowded conditions they had endured in other camps. The tile floors were spotless, the sinks gleaming, and the showers were surrounded by pristine white curtains. There was no lingering smell of filth or disease, no sense of discomfort, just cleanliness, a fresh start. Greta stood under the stream of hot water, letting it cascade over her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth seep into her aching muscles. For so long, she had been used to the constant dirt and grime that clung to her skin. She had learned to endure the discomfort, to accept that a clean body was a luxury far beyond her reach. But here, in this strange new place, she was being treated like a human being again, and it felt almost overwhelming. The water, the soap, the simple act of washing away the dirt of war. It was a small thing, but it carried more meaning than she could put into words. The other women were equally stunned by the experience. Some of them hesitated at first, unsure if they should allow themselves this luxury. They had grown accustomed to deprivation, to not expecting anything from life. But as they stepped into the showers, they too began to feel the healing power of cleanliness. It wasn't just their bodies that were being cleansed, it was their spirits as well. The act of scrubbing away the dirt of war, of washing away the fear and pain they had carried for so long, was like a symbolic rebirth. For the first time, they felt that perhaps they could leave behind the horrors they had endured and move forward. After the showers, they were given fresh, clean clothes that smelled of soap and freshness. It was almost too much to believe. These weren't the drab, ragged uniforms they had become used to, but real, proper clothing that made them feel like they had regained a piece of their dignity. The fabric of the shirts and pants was soft to the touch, the colors bright and welcoming. As they put on their new clothes, they exchanged looks of disbelief. For some, this small act of kindness seemed like the greatest gift they had ever received. They were not just prisoners anymore. They were being treated like people, like individuals worthy of respect. As they settled into their new routines, the effects of this small yet profound gesture began to show. The women's energy began to change. They were no longer huddled in fear or bracing themselves for the next blow. Instead, they began to engage with the camp's daily life, participating in various activities and working alongside the American soldiers. For many of them, this was a strange and foreign experience. They had spent so long in an environment where survival was their only priority that they had forgotten how to live. Now, they were being given the chance to rediscover what it meant to be human. In the mornings, some of the women took to the garden, planting seeds and tending to the crops. Others worked in the kitchens, preparing meals with the same care they had once given to their own homes. The camp, which had once felt like a place of imprisonment, began to feel like a strange kind of sanctuary. The work was not forced, it was meaningful, and it helped them regain a sense of purpose. The women found themselves laughing more often, sharing stories from their pasts, and, in many ways, rediscovering parts of themselves they thought were lost forever. In the evenings, the women gathered in the mess hall, where they were served warm, nourishing meals. The food was simple, but it was filling and wholesome. No longer did they have to fight for scraps or endure the constant hunger that had defined their existence in other camps. As they ate, they spoke about their lives before the war, about the families they had left behind, about the homes they had been forced to abandon. They spoke of the things they had lost and the things they hoped to regain. And through it all, there was an unspoken bond that began to form between them, a bond forged in the shared experience of survival and the unexpected kindness they were now receiving. The small comforts of life in the camp began to create a sense of normalcy. The women, who had once been stripped of their humanity, were slowly being restored to it. They had not yet dared to believe in a future free from fear, but they could feel the possibility of it. The American soldiers, who had once seemed like strangers, began to feel more like allies, even if the barriers between them remained. There was still an undeniable tension, but the simple acts of kindness, the soap, the clean clothes, the food, began to dissolve some of that tension. It wasn't an easy process, and it wasn't without its challenges, but the women could feel something shifting. As the days went on, the effect of cleanliness, both physical and emotional, became more apparent. The women began to take pride in their appearance once again. They combed their hair, straightened their clothes, and stood a little taller. They were no longer the broken, defeated women they had been when they first arrived. They were survivors, and they were beginning to reclaim their sense of self. The simple act of washing away the filth of war had given them more than just physical relief. It had given them back their humanity. And for the first time in a long time, they dared to hope. The weeks at the camp passed in a blur of new experiences and tentative hope. The women, though still haunted by the scars of war, began to find small moments of peace and normalcy in their routines. They had started to forge new relationships with the American soldiers and medical staff, relationships that were initially built on necessity but slowly evolved into something more complicated. It was impossible for them to completely erase the deep mistrust that had been drilled into them over years of suffering, yet they found themselves drawn to the human kindness they had never expected to encounter from their captors. Grete, still adjusting to the routine, had found a strange sort of comfort in her work in the camp kitchen. The rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and serving food was something that allowed her to focus, to quiet the constant storm in her mind. She had begun to exchange small talk with some of the soldiers who came to eat in the mess hall. They seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and stories, asking her questions about Germany, about her life before the war, and listening without judgment. The conversations were nothing extraordinary, but they provided a small sense of connection that had been absent for so long. It was a stark contrast to the hostile and impersonal interactions she had experienced in other camps. In the evenings, when the women gathered in the barracks, the conversation often turned to their past lives. They spoke of the towns they had come from, the families they had left behind, and the homes they once lived in. Slowly, the walls between them started to come down, and they began to feel something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time: community. They were no longer just a group of strangers thrown together by circumstance, but women who shared common experiences, common losses. This shared bond, forged in the crucible of war, and now nurtured by the relative peace of the camp, gave them strength. They had suffered unimaginable horrors, but together they began to rebuild, piece by piece. Despite these small joys, an undercurrent of tension ran through the camp. The women couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to simmer just below the surface. The American soldiers, while outwardly kind, had a cold, almost clinical way of treating their status as prisoners. They were polite, even friendly at times, but there was always the unspoken reminder that the women were not free. They were still captives. The women, in turn, struggled with their conflicting emotions. They had been taught to fear and despise their captors, yet they couldn't deny the kindness they had been shown. They were caught between two worlds, the world of their memories, filled with the cruelty of war, and the world that was being built here, one small kindness at a time. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, the tension took a more tangible form. Colonel Harrison, a high-ranking officer who had taken a more hands-on role in the camp's operations, made a surprise visit. His presence was different from that of Captain Mitchell, who had earned the women's trust with her calm and empathetic manner. Harrison's arrival brought with it a change in atmosphere, one that the women could feel in their bones. He was stern, calculating, and had a presence that commanded attention. There was something about him that made the women uneasy, even though he hadn't said a word to them yet. The women had noticed that, in the days leading up to Harrison's visit, some of the American guards had begun to act differently. They had become more formal, their usual friendly demeanor replaced by a colder, more distant attitude. Conversations between the soldiers and the women, which had once been warm and easy, had become stilted and awkward. Gret, as she worked in the kitchen, overheard fragments of hushed discussions between the soldiers about increased security and intelligence gathering. She couldn't make out the details, but the words were enough to make her heart race. It was as if a dark cloud had descended over the camp, and the safety they had briefly felt seemed to be slipping away. That night, after dinner, the women gathered in the barracks, whispering among themselves. The mood was heavy, filled with a quiet fear that they couldn't quite articulate. Anna, the oldest of the group, who had been reserved and distant since their arrival, spoke up. Her voice, usually so calm, trembled slightly as she mentioned the change in the guards' behavior. The others nodded in agreement, their faces filled with a mix of anxiety and suspicion. They knew the Americans were watching them, but they had believed that the kindness they had been shown would last. Now, with the arrival of Colonel Harrison, they feared that the fragile sense of trust they had built would be shattered. The next day, the women were informed that there would be a meeting with the camp's officers. They were told to prepare for a discussion about their roles in the camp, and some of them would be asked to take on additional tasks. Greta couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The conversations she overheard, the coldness that had settled over the camp, were all signs that the Americans' patience was running thin. She had seen this before, this tightening of control, this shift in attitude. It was a familiar pattern that led to nothing good. As the meeting approached, Greta found herself standing in front of the camp's administration building with the other women. They were told to wait outside, and as they did, the weight of their uncertainty pressed down on them. They had learned to expect the worst, and now they were preparing themselves for whatever was coming. When the doors to the building finally opened, they were greeted not by Captain Mitchell, but by Colonel Harrison, flanked by several high-ranking officers. His cold gaze swept over the group of women, and in that moment, Greta could sense the shift. The atmosphere had changed irreversibly. Harrison spoke to them in a commanding tone, outlining the new expectations for their behavior and roles in the camp. He spoke of discipline, of security measures, and of the importance of cooperation. The words themselves were nothing new. They had heard similar speeches before. But the way Harrison spoke, with an air of authority that bordered on cruelty, sent a chill down Greta's spine. She could see the women around her stiffen, their faces tightening in response to the underlying threat in his voice. This was no longer the camp where they were treated with kindness and respect. This was a place where power and control were being reasserted, and it felt like everything they had come to believe in was being torn away. As the meeting concluded and the women were escorted back to their barracks, Gret's mind raced. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something darker was coming. The hope they had briefly held on to was beginning to feel fragile, like a dream slipping through their fingers. The reality of their situation had never truly gone away. It had simply been masked by the temporary kindness they had received. And now, with Colonel Harrison's arrival, it felt like that mask was being ripped off, revealing the harsh truth they had always known. They were prisoners, and nothing, not even the fleeting comforts they had been given, would change that. The days following Colonel Harrison's speech were tense and filled with uncertainty. The camp, which had once seemed like a place of relative peace, now felt like a pressure cooker, simmering with the fear of an impending explosion. The women could feel the shift in the air, the subtle but undeniable change in how they were treated. The once friendly guards now moved through the camp with a colder, more calculating demeanor, as if they were looking for reasons to assert their authority. The simple, fleeting pleasures they had come to enjoy, meals together, work in the gardens, even casual conversations with soldiers, had been overshadowed by a growing sense of dread. Greta found herself walking the camp's paths with a constant knot in her stomach. Her once hopeful steps had become heavy, burdened by the fear that they were all about to be thrust back into a harsher reality. It was as if the kindness the women had received was just a mirage, a brief oasis in a desert of suffering. The warmth they had felt in the camp seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a growing tension that crept into every interaction. The other women, too, began to retreat into themselves, their eyes darting nervously, as if they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. The most unsettling change was the way the women were now being monitored. There were more guards patrolling the camp, their eyes ever watchful, their hands hovering near their weapons. It was clear that the camp was no longer a place for small acts of kindness or the rebuilding of dignity. Colonel Harrison had made it clear that the women were not to be trusted, that they had a role to play in the larger war effort, and that their compliance would be forced, not earned. Every movement, every glance seemed to be scrutinized now. Greta couldn't help but feel like she was being suffocated by the weight of their watchful eyes. One morning, as Gret worked in the kitchen, preparing the day's meals, she overheard a conversation between two soldiers. They spoke in hushed tones, but Gret caught enough of their words to send a chill down her spine. There were whispers of interrogations starting soon, of deeper scrutiny, more invasive questioning. The soldiers seemed to be under pressure from their superiors to extract useful information from the women, to find something they could use for the ongoing war efforts. The casual kindness that had once defined their interactions now felt like a distant memory. The soldiers' faces were harder now, their smiles gone. Gret realized, with a sinking feeling, that the American military wasn't treating them like people anymore. They were tools, resources to be used, to be broken if necessary. That afternoon, Greta was summoned along with a few other women to the administration building. The air was thick with tension as they walked across the camp. The building, once a neutral space where they had received instructions, now felt like a chamber of uncertainty. As they entered, they were met by a stern-looking officer, someone they had never seen before. His uniform was crisp, his gaze cold. He told them, without preamble, that they would be questioned about their time in Germany, about their families, and about any information they might have that could help the Allies. The Geneva Convention, the promises of humane treatment, they seemed to have been forgotten in that moment. What remained was the hard edge of military necessity. Greta was the first to be called in. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked into the sterile room, the smell of disinfectant in the air. The officer motioned for her to sit. He didn't introduce himself, didn't ask her name. He simply began his questioning, asking about her knowledge of German military movements, about factories, about any strategic information she could provide. Greta's mind raced. She had never been part of any military operation. She had been a civilian, a young woman living in a small town, working in a bakery. She knew nothing about weapons or military strategies. But the officer's eyes never wavered. He was relentless, his questions cold and methodical. She tried to remain calm, answering as best as she could, but with each question the pressure mounted. The officer was trying to break her, to make her crack. He didn't believe her answers. He didn't care about the truth. All that mattered was getting something, anything, that could be of use. Grete felt the weight of his stare, the unspoken accusation in his voice. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she was just a woman who had been caught in the chaos of a war she never wanted. But all she could do was sit there, trying to appear as composed as possible, while her mind screamed for an escape. The interrogation lasted for hours, but it felt like a lifetime. Finally, they released her, but the damage had already been done. The walls around her had begun to close in once again. She was no longer a person. She was a prisoner, a subject to be examined, dissected, and used. As she walked back to the barracks, her legs felt heavy, as though they could no longer carry her. The camp, which had once felt like a strange refuge, now felt like a trap. The guards who had once smiled at her now looked at her with suspicion. The small victories they had fought for, the kindness, the respect, seemed like distant memories, replaced by the harsh reality of what they were: prisoners, with no rights, no freedom, no escape. The atmosphere in the camp had shifted irreparably. The women no longer exchanged the same hopeful glances they once had. There were no more casual conversations, no more quiet moments of respite. Instead, there was only a constant undercurrent of fear, of uncertainty. They had been shown what it felt like to live with dignity, but now they were being reminded, in brutal terms, that dignity was a luxury they could no longer afford. They were prisoners, and nothing more. The promises of the past seemed like a cruel joke now, a false hope that had been shattered beyond repair. Greta returned to her bunk that night, her body tired and her spirit drained. She could hear the faint whispers of the other women as they lay in their beds, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. What could she say? How could she explain the emptiness that had taken root in her heart? The world she had once believed in was gone. She was no longer sure of anything. She had been given a glimpse of something better, something that felt almost human. But that glimpse had faded, and in its place all that remained was fear.